Good evening. I'm Hollis Robbins, Dean of the College of Humanities here at University of Utah. One of the perks of my job is the opportunity to meet and talk to all the global thinkers and artists and innovative scholars supported by and invited to campus to share their work under the banner of the Tanner Humanities Center. This year, we're celebrating the 35th anniversary of the center. Since its founding in 88, the Tanner Humanities Center has provided to the U and our broader public community opportunities to share, to exchange complex ideas, to ask hard questions, and to ponder tough solutions. This fall, we've heard from Azar Nafisi and Heather McGee, among others, and this spring from Kim Stanley Robinson and Kyle White, among many others. Over the past several days, as our collective eyes have turned to the skies to wonder what is looking down on us, I've wondered about explaining ourselves to alien life forms. How is it that the human species has evolved to the moment where one key manner of addressing global problems is writing very big books? But there we are. And now I'd like to introduce Erika George, director of the Tanner Humanities Center. Dr. George is the Samuel D. Thurman Professor of Law at the S.J. Quinney College of Law, in the building we are, and the author of Incorporating Rights, Strategies to Advance Corporate Accountability, as well as Racism as Human Rights, as a Human Rights Risk, Reconsidering the Corporate Responsibility to Respect Rights. Dr. George will, in turn, introduce our guest, the great author Naomi Oreskes. Please join me in welcoming Erika George.
Good evening, everyone. I also have the responsibility of thanking you for being here and thanking the people who made this evening possible. First, O.C. Tanner and the Tanner family. As you may know, the Tanner Center is named for educator and entrepreneur Obert Tanner, a philosopher and founder of the O.C. Tanner Corporation. He's a philanthropist, and along with his wife, Grace Tanner, gave us the gift that keeps giving stimulation and intellectual inquiry to us today. The center advances three main aims through academic research, educational enrichment, and public outreach and engagement, which we're doing tonight. I'd like to thank the King's English Bookshop, our co-event host, outside after the talk. They are here with books, and our author will be signing them, so please stick around for that. The College of Humanities and my dean, Hollis Robbins, from whom you've just heard. The College of Law for their in-kind donation of this space, and my Tanner Center staff, Beth James, the administrative director, Jeremy Rosen, the associate director for faculty, Susan Anderson, the development officer, Missy Weeks, the marketing and communications specialist, and our student graduate research assistants, Skylar Fetter and Sean Collins. And now, it is my extraordinary honor to introduce the conversation with Professor Naomi Oreskes about her new book, The Big Myth: How American Business Taught Us to Loathe the Government and Love the Free Market. Naomi Oreskes is a professor of history of science at Harvard University and the author of nearly 200 scholarly papers and popular articles. Her opinion pieces have appeared in the New York Times and the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times and the Times of London, and many others. Her TED Talk, which I recommend to you and had occasion to watch recently, Why We Should Trust Scientists, has been viewed more than 1 million times. She is an active participant in the World Economic Forum in Davos, and she lives in Carlisle, Massachusetts. Over dinner, I learned that the origins of this book began here at Alta, at Hellgate. She received a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2018, and it was there that she began writing this book. She's been coming to Utah for 22 years off and on, and that to me makes her practically Utahn. The important fact, well, there are many important facts to know about Professor Oreskes, but in 2004, it was she that authored the Scientific Consensus on Climate Change. She was the first one to let the world know that there was a scientific consensus, indeed, that human activities caused the changing climate that we are now confronting. And in this book, she takes on the challenges and helps us understand how we came to be where we are today. So please join me in welcoming Professor Oreskes. Is this working? It is now. Okay, perfect. Okay, you begin the big myth telling your readers that they are in for the true story of a false idea. I'd like you to talk about power of ideas and specifically the idea that you examine in this book, free market fundamentalism. What is it?
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for having me here tonight. Is this working? No, it
Yeah, the
doesn't
pressure
sound
is-
like it is. Do I have to turn something
Do
on?
this one. This.
There you go. You have to always wait for the green light. So the book is about a myth. It's about the myth of the magic of the marketplace. And I think you said something really important just a moment ago. We live in a world where people are skeptical about ideas, where people, I think, tend to think that money talks and ideas don't matter, just egghead academics. But actually, ideas are very, very powerful. And one of the things that Eric Conway and I realized and tried to bring out in this book was about how this particular idea, the idea of the free market, the free market, or the idea of the magic of the marketplace, how this idea has really taken hold in American culture, how many people think that our problems can be best solved by leaving it to the wisdom of markets, and how many people think that government just gets in the way. And you can read this any day of the week in the Wall Street Journal, but even in the New York Times or supposedly liberal newspapers, that the solution to our problems is for government to get out of the way and let entrepreneurs and creative innovators solve our problems. Well, first of all, it's not true. History doesn't support that idea. History, in fact, refutes it amply. And yet, many, many people, including many educated people, including some of my colleagues at Harvard, probably some of your professors at the University of Chicago, believe this. And so we wanted to know, why would educated, intelligent people believe a myth that was so obviously untrue, that even the slightest understanding of history would tell you was untrue? And so that's what we set out to do in this book. It's not just to explain the myth, but also to explain where it came from and how a group of people consciously worked to make us believe it.
And it was a fascinating history that I was not familiar with. And we'll talk about my alma mater in a bit. But now that we know what the free market is, or the free market fundamentalism is, I'd like to discuss how it became so pervasive and so popular. So in The Big Myth, Professor Oreskes tells the story of how American business leaders intervened in politics, popular culture, education system, religious life, academic discourse to promote this myth. The influence of business over politics, I think, is pretty clear to most of us. I think of Citizens United, the case that deems corporate speech, free speech within electoral politics, campaign finance, as making it very obvious that there is influence of business in our politics. I was less familiar with your examination of other spheres, and I wanted to turn to those spheres now. So I've structured my questions to take us through each sphere, and I'd like to start with the academy and education, where ideas are formed. Nobel laureate Milton Friedman, at my alma mater, the University of Chicago, they both figure prominently in the making of the market mythology myth that you describe. In the first year at University of Chicago, I don't know if there are other Chicagoans in the room, we have a core curriculum, and everyone is required to read the same texts. Not only do we read Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, we read Friedrich Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, which also you discuss. How did that institution play a role in the free market project at Chicago and beyond? And then I'm going to ask you about a thesis, but how did that idea space, the role of the university, serve in launching this?
Well, most of us, particularly academics, would like to believe that the books we teach, the ideas we promote, are the best ideas. They're the ones that have stood the test of time, or they're the ideas that have the most evidence to support them. Certainly in science, I began my career as a scientist. We would argue that the theories we teach are the ones that are most well supported by evidence. And we'd like to believe that in the humanities and the social sciences, the ideas that are taught are the ones that have, ironically, won out in the marketplace of ideas. And academics talk all the time about the marketplace of ideas, the idea that these ideas have come to the fore because they're right, because they're true, because the evidence supports them. But that's not the case in a big section of modern American economics. And so one of the things we show in the book, and we have 2 chapters that deals with this, is that actually the Chicago School of Economics was cultivated by American business people, and that many of the key ideas that they promoted were not, in fact, supported by evidence, but were part of a political ideology to promote free market thinking in order to prevent government regulation of the marketplace and protect the prerogatives of the businessmen who were funding these projects. And so we talk about a few different things that happened, but one of the key ones is that a group of businessmen led by an executive named Jasper Crane, who had been a major executive at the DuPont Corporation, and a man named Harold Lunno, who ran one of America's first libertarian foundations, a fund called the Volcker Fund, gave the money to do, well, two key things. So first of all, they hired Friedrich von Hayek. So how many people here have ever heard of von Hayek? A few, but a lot haven't.
That's
quite a few.
That's about
Yeah.
half the room to me.
Yeah, about half the room. Okay. So for those of you who don't, von Hayek is one of the founders of neoliberalism. He's one of the people who was most important in starting to create the ideology that markets should simply be allowed to function on their own, government should get out of the way. And he is a hero to many extreme right-wing people in the United States. So if you listen to Glenn Beck or Rush Limbaugh, you will often hear them quoting from this book. It's called The Road to Serfdom. Von Hayek was given the National Medal of Freedom by President George H.W. Bush. And President George H.W. Bush once described this as a book. It was published in 1944. He described it as a book that still thrills readers everywhere. Okay, so it's actually a very interesting book. It's a complicated book. There's a lot in it that I agree with. I don't think it's all wrong, but there's a lot of it in it that is wrong. And there's a lot in it that has been absolutely disproven by the facts of history. After World War II, these businessmen, Jasper Crane and Harold Lunno, went to the president of the University of Chicago to try to get Hayek hired at the University of Chicago. At the time, he was in England at the London School of Economics. The faculty at Chicago did not want him. They thought that the argument was wrong. They said this, it's almost all theory, there's no evidence. Lunno gave the president of the university the money to hire Friedrich von Hayek behind closed doors. So he did not win in an open competition, which is pretty ironic for people who think competition is the solution to everything, right? So we found a lot of ironies in this book. We should talk about Ayn Rand later.
Yes.
So they hire him, and they also give the university the money to create something they call the Free Market Project. And as part of this, they hire a suite of faculty, one of whom is Milton Friedman. And they also give Friedman the money to develop a set of lectures, and those lectures become his book, Capitalism and Freedom, which is one of the most influential texts in economics maybe ever written. I mean, people have compared him to Adam Smith. And again, no open competition, no call for proposals, no having to go through competitive peer review to get the money for this project. It's all funded by American businessmen who have the ideology or the agenda, I guess is the right word, to prevent government regulation of the marketplace, to prevent environmental regulation, to prevent workplace safety regulation. And these people are also linked back to the first chapter of our book, which was about a campaign to defend and protect child labor.
Wonderful. I want to ask you, this is still in the vein, can you explain the indivisibility thesis? I think this is central through line to the Chicago School of Economics, which everyone who goes through gets steeped in. So what did the indivisibility theory accomplish?
So part of the problem that these people faced was that most of what they were arguing, well, they had two big problems. Most of what they were arguing was obviously self-serving, and it was false. So they had a big problem. How do you persuade people of something that's self-serving and untrue? Well, one of the ways you do is to develop a theory and to hire academics to help you give that theory credibility. So they developed an argument they called the indivisibility thesis. Sometimes they called it the inseparability thesis. And the argument went like this, that economic and political freedom were two sides of the same coin, indivisible. And so if you compromised economic freedom, even for something that would seem like a good idea, like maybe not letting children as young as 2 years old work in textile mills, it was actually bad because it would compromise your political freedom. And you'd be on a slippery slope to totalitarianism. This was the core argument that they began to develop in the 1930s as an argument to defend child labor, to oppose workmen's compensation, and then to oppose nearly all of the reforms of the New Deal. But it was obviously self-serving, and it was untrue. I mean, there was no evidence to support it. In fact, there were many countries in the world. I mean, Germany had workmen's compensation laws going back to the era of Bismarck. It hadn't made them totalitarian. I mean, they did become totalitarian later, but for totally different reasons. So the facts of history really refuted this argument. So they recruit von Hayek and also von Hayek's mentor, Ludwig von Mises. I don't know how many people have heard of von Mises. Yeah, he's considered the founder of neoliberalism. So they recruit von Mises and von Hayek to come to the United States, just as they worked behind closed doors to get von Hayek hired at Chicago. They get von Mises hired at NYU, not generally thought of as a reactionary university, and they place them in academic positions to begin to give intellectual credibility to this otherwise self-serving argument.
That was astounding to me when I learned it. It truly was. That was astounding to me when I learned it. It also speaks to the power of cluster hires.
Open searches, peer review.
Okay, so moving out of the sphere of the academy, I'd like to take entertainment, where ideas are widely distributed to a mass market. So as president, Ronald Reagan would award Milton Friedman the Presidential Medal of Freedom and the National Medal of Science. Many of us and many of your readers will know that Reagan was an actor before he was a politician. How did General Electric save Ronald Reagan's acting career and shift his politics?
Thank you for that question. So one of the difficulties of writing a book like this is that, you know, if this were a movie, you wouldn't believe it. You'd think, oh no, I mean, these people can't be that organized, but they were. And so there's a network of corporations that are sort of key in this story. One of them is the DuPont Corporation, which I've already mentioned, and the other is General Electric. In the 1950s, General Electric was one of the most reactionary of the sort of Fortune 500 companies. They built a lot of good technology, they made good light bulbs, but they also engaged in egregious anti-union tactics and actually were prosecuted for violations of national labor laws. So they broke the law. But one of the ways they did what they did, it wasn't just, they had this whole universe of operations that didn't just involve manufacturing light bulbs and jet engines. It also involved manufacturing a myth, building up a kind of ideology. And so GE had a massive propaganda campaign to persuade its own workers and the people in the communities where it operated that unions were evil, that unions were un-American, that they were all infiltrated by communists, and that it really wasn't in the interest of workers to engage in collective bargaining, that the workers should trust the corporation to have their best interest at stake. So how did they do this? Well, they had magazines, they had newsletters, they had book groups, they organized, GE managers would organize book groups in communities. And how many people here are in a book group? A lot. Imagine if the reading list came from General Electric, right? Or maybe today, Facebook, right? Yeah. So this is the equivalent. So they would send out these reading lists, and they, of course, included von Hayek and other folks who I talk about in the book, to promote this message in the communities that, you know, what's good for corporate America is good for Americans. And a key part of this story was Ronald Reagan. So in the mid-50s, Ronald Reagan's acting career was pretty much derailed. He had never been a great actor. He had made some pretty, frankly, idiotic movies with chimpanzees, you know. Yeah. Anyway, you could talk to film critics about that. But he was a sort of B-grade actor. You know, he had made a career. He was mostly known as the president of the Screen Actors Guild, and he was a Democrat. He was a New Deal Democrat. But he gets recruited by GE to be the host of a television program called General Electric Theater. How many people here ever remember that? Oh, okay, it's a bit of an older audience. In the late 1950s, GE Theater was the third most popular program in the United States behind, anyone want to guess? Ed Sullivan, excellent, and? Oh. No, I Love Lucy. Okay, so millions, tens of millions of Americans watched this program every week, and Ronald Reagan was the host. And usually the programs would be didactic programs that emphasized individual responsibility, pulling yourself up by the bootstraps. There's one episode we talk about in the book where it's about an alcoholic, and his friends all say to him, "This is a disease, you need to get help." And he says, "No, This is my responsibility. I'm the one who poured that alcohol down my throat. I'm the one who has to fix this. And the end of this story is that this guy cures himself and then helps other alcoholics. Yeah, so you get the idea. And then each week there would be a didactic message about the greatness of General Electric and the greatness of American capitalism and American individualism. So Reagan becomes the spokesperson both in this television program, but also half of his job is hosting the television show, and the other half is going on the lecture circuit and going to General Electric communities where there are factories or other facilities, and meeting with people. And he begins to develop what's effectively a stump speech about the evils of government. We all know his line from his inaugural address, government is not the solution to your problems, government is the problem. He developed that idea while he was working at General Electric. And that then becomes the basis of the speech he makes nominating Barry Goldwater at the Republican National Convention in 1960. So that's what launches his political career. So he makes this transition from actor to politician through General Electric. And in the process of doing that, his politics completely change. So he goes in a pro-union Democrat, he comes out a pro-union and pro-government Democrat, he comes out an anti-union, anti-government Republican. And one more piece. So who bankrolls his campaign when he decides to run for governor of California? This was unprecedented at the time. I mean, now we're used to celebrities and actors and different people running for all kinds of offices. But in those days, it was quite unusual. No one had ever been governor of California who hadn't previously been either an attorney general or mayor of a major city or had had some kind of life in politics. Who bankrolled his campaign? Well, you could guess. General Electric executives.
So there was another term in this book, like the Indivisibility Thesis, integration propaganda. Mm-hmm. Would you define that and provide an example?
Sure. So integration propaganda is when people develop propaganda, but they find ways to get it to the media, it could be newspapers, television, radio, magazines, and to find ways to get journalists to incorporate the propaganda into articles as if it were actually news. And so this was developed, the idea was developed by Edward Bernays, who's often considered to be the father of public relations. He wrote a very famous book in 1928 with the title Propaganda. He worked extensively for the tobacco industry, and he also worked extensively for the National Association of Manufacturers. In the 1930s, NAM, the National Association of Manufacturers, launched a major propaganda campaign to promote the Indivisibility Thesis, to promote a pro-market, anti-government idea. And it was absolutely massive. We know that they spent hundreds of millions of dollars in 1930 dollars. So, I mean, this would be probably like $1 billion today. And a major part of the propaganda campaign involved materials that were sent to newspaper editors and journalists around the country. Often they would be press releases which would be presented as news events or facts, but were in fact propaganda written by their propaganda offices. They also developed a radio program, which they sent to over 300 radio stations around the United States, and this was broadcast over the airways, again, with a very individualist, pro-capitalist, anti-government message. But nowadays, if you were to listen to something, like even if you're on NPR, they'll say this program made possible by a generous grant from the General Electric Corporation. I mean, you know who it is who's funding the thing, or at least in most cases you do. But in these, there was never any discussion. So tens of millions of Americans heard this radio program every week. It was called the American Family Robinson, so playing on the Swiss Family Robinson. If you listened to that program, you would never have known that this program was written, designed, and paid for by the National Association of Manufacturers.
Right. So pervasive and not entirely obvious.
No, in fact, deliberately not obvious.
Right.
The whole point of integration propaganda is that it's hidden. When I was writing Merchants of Doubt, we came across one document where an executive at Philip Morris was talking about a whole propaganda campaign they were involved with, and he had written on the bottom in pencil on the paper, good job hiding the Philip Morris fingerprints.
Okay.
And so that's how a lot of this material is too. This was all being funded by corporate America, but the corporate American fingerprints were hidden from the viewers, the readers, the listeners.
There's got to be an invisible hand joke.
Exactly, I know, that's the actual,
Okay.
yeah, you're right, we'll have to work on that.
So I want to turn now to the sphere of religion. You detail how freedom of religion becomes intertwined as well with free market fundamentalism over time. You cite a 1964 Opinion Research Corporation poll that found ministers were far more important molders of public opinion than any other American group. That actually surprised me. I don't know that that holds today. Many readers will be familiar with Norman Vincent Peale. Anyone? All right. And The Power of Positive Thinking, that sold more than 5 million copies at the time. Would you take us through the tenets of what you deem, or what was deemed, Christian economics and the tactics of the Christian Freedom Foundation as in his teachings?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I will. And before I do that, though, I just want to say something. I mean, Peale is a really interesting character because if you think about his book, The Power of Positive Thinking, which has been read by millions of people who are not necessarily religious people, but what is the message of that? It's a pull yourself up by your bootstraps message. You can do fine, you can succeed, you can become wealthy. All you have to do is think positively. And there's no discussion about education or opportunity or overcoming racism or sexism, right? It's all about, it's just up to you. And as long as you think positively, everything's going to be okay. Well, if you actually think about that, it's a pretty interesting message because on the one hand, positive thinking does, in fact, often help people. But the idea that that's all you need to succeed in American society is rather pernicious, right? So where does Peale come from? How does he become so famous? Well, it turns out, again, so as I said, the folks who are pushing this ideology, as I already mentioned, they had two big problems. One is that it was self-serving. The other was that it was false. But the third problem is that most people in America in the mid-century thought it was unchristian. And this particularly comes up as an issue during the Great Depression. So many Americans before the Great Depression were skeptical of government involvement in social programs, social welfare. I mean, people were divided. Progressive era was all about improving the social safety net. Many people thought that was important, but there were a lot of people who were skeptical. But when the Great Depression hits, capitalism has failed massively, right? The marketplace hasn't even managed to give people jobs, much less health insurance or paid vacation or protect children from child labor. So it's really a kind of catastrophe for capitalism. And one of the things that happens is that Herbert Hoover, who's also an important figure in this book, he's making the argument in the early years of the Depression that yes, it's really bad what's going on, and yes, people are suffering, we don't deny that, but it's not the role of the government to solve people's suffering. Yeah. It's the role of charity, private charity. And so he calls on private charity to respond, and private charity does respond, but the scale of the problem is just so much bigger than what charitable individuals and groups can do. And that's when Hoover loses the presidency to FDR, and in 1932, FDR says, the scale of this problem is too big for anything but the federal government. And so the New Deal is really a response to the catastrophe of the Great Depression. And at that point, what happens is a lot of Republicans, a lot of conservatives who had voted for Herbert Hoover actually support the New Deal because they see that people are suffering and they feel that it would be unchristian not to attend to their needs. So this is a gigantic problem. This is big problem number 3 for the market fundamentalists. They want to say, just let the marketplace solve the problem. But Christian theologians, particularly what we would today call mainline Protestant groups, but also Catholics, say the government has to step in. This problem is too big for us to deal with. And so the market fundamentalists say, well, we have to do something about that. We have to change that. And so one chapter in the book is about a group of people led by J. Howard Pugh, who was the president of Sun Oil Corporation. He was also an executive with the National Association of Manufacturers. And ironically, the man whose money created the Pew Charitable Trust today. And if you read the webpage of the Pew Charitable Trust, you can find buried down in very fine print, we do not necessarily subscribe to the views of our founder, J. Howard Pugh.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Pew decided that the solution to this problem was to persuade Christians of market fundamentalism, to persuade Christians that capitalism and Christianity went hand in hand. And that was a pretty neat trick, because if you know your New Testament, which I'm assuming quite a few people in this room probably do, what is Jesus' message? Jesus' message is about loving the poor. The Bible says it's harder for a rich man to go to heaven than for a camel to go through the eye of a needle, right? So, Jesus' message is a message of love and compassion and of taking care of the poor. And market fundamentalism flies in the face of that message. So what do? They decide to change the Christian message and to organize to persuade ministers that capitalism is consistent with Christian theology. And so they begin to fund revisions of curricula at seminaries. They create 2 different Christian journals, including one called Christian Economics, which they could have called Christian Free Market Economics, because that's what it is. It's not about Christian compassion economics. It's about market fundamentalism. And they begin to fund evangelical preachers who they believe can bring the message forward. One of them is Billy Graham, and the other is Norman Vincent Peale. And one of the fun details in the book that Eric Conway found was that Norman Vincent Peale officiated at the marriage of Donald Trump and his first wife, Ivanka.
Fascinating how this all comes together.
I know, so if you thought that Donald Trump came out of nowhere, not quite true.
Yeah. So I wish we had time to go through all the spheres, but we don't. And I'm coming to the conclusion of the questions that I want to ask. And on the slide here is something called Slido. If you take your phone and register in that, you can ask a question. It'll show up here, and I'll be able to ask them for the screen. And we also have 2 microphones on either side of the stairs here. So if you use Slido, you can download that to your phone or get it on your website and then text this, and you can ask questions there. So turning from spheres to specific individuals, there was another name that appeared, much beloved to me. As a child, I loved Little House on the Prairie. Absolutely could not get enough of it. I must have read it dozens of times over. And then reading The Big Myth, I learned things I never knew about one of my favorite childhood authors. So would you please explain the role of Laura Ingalls Wilder and Rose Wilder in advancing the myth?
Thank you. Well, one of the hard things about writing a book like this is sometimes you find things that break your heart. And I also read all the Little House on the Prairie books, and so did my children. I still have some of them in the attic. So how many people here read the Little House on the Prairie books growing up? Yeah. How many people watched the television series? Yeah. So almost everybody. How many people, is there anyone here who hasn't heard of it? No. So everyone's at least 1 or 2. Okay. Well, when you read the book, you can learn about it. But so the Little House on the Prairie series was one of the best-selling children's books ever published in the United States. It was made into a television series starring the dishy Michael Landon. I'm dating myself, but and it was incredibly popular. Sold millions and millions and millions of copies. And these books were marketed and advertised as the true life story of Laura Ingalls Wilder growing up in the American frontier. It turns out they were not the true life stories. They were actually written by her daughter, Rose Wilder Lane, who was a libertarian theorist and a friend of Herbert Hoover and a friend of J. Howard Pugh. I know, it's really creepy. It's like you start to feel like you're becoming a conspiracy theorist, except these are all true facts. So Laura Ingalls Wilder did write notes. She wrote rough notes about episodes and incidents that had happened in her life. But then her daughter, Rose, crafted it into a kind of libertarian parable. And if you go back and reread these books as an adult, you see it. So in this book, the government plays no role, even though the government, of course, was responsible for the Homestead Act. For better or worse, the government was responsible for Indian removals that made it possible for these people to be there in the first place. The government protected settlers through the U.S. military. I mean, so many things about their lives that would not have been possible without government action involvement. All of that is completely expunged. And instead, a story is told of hard work, individualism. Everything good that happens is because Pa loves the children and he works hard. The reality is actually the Wilder family was a complete failure. Their life on the prairie was more or less a disaster, and they on more than one occasion gave up. So it's a completely fabricated story of success through individualism and hard work, none of which was actually true.
Another figure, Ayn Rand. You'd asked me to ask about her, and I am. Novelist and philosopher, Ayn Rand is perhaps best known for her books, The Fountainhead, Atlas Shrugged. and for her philosophy, objectivism. But from your book, I also learned about another work that she wrote, The Screen Guide for Americans. Would you please tell us what that is?
Right. Well, part of what's amazing about this book is the astonishing hypocrisy that you find among some of these people who will go on and on and on about freedom, 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 except when the freedom threatens their own interests or is somehow in opposition to what they believe. So Ayn Rand is probably the most famous libertarian thinker in US history. Her books have sold millions and millions of copies. And when I meet climate change deniers, sometimes when I ask them about their philosophy, almost very, very commonly, they'll tell me they read Atlas Shrugged in high school, and that's why they became a libertarian. Okay, well, so we could talk about the virtues or lack thereof of Rand's writings, but she's super famous for writing these novels that celebrate a kind of extreme individualism, extreme anti-government ideology, and these two of her novels, Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead, were made into Hollywood films, and in some cases starring very famous actors. While she was writing these books and making these films, promoting free thinking, freedom, the absolute right of the individual to think and do what he wants to do, and he deliberately. She's also a female misogynist, but that's I know that's a whole different story. Yeah, she's deeply misogynist. She was the author of the 1950s Hollywood censorship codes, and this is what. So this great champion of freedom is meanwhile writing censorship codes, and what are the censorship codes focused on? It's not what you might think. It's not sex or nudity or foul language or violence. It's that you shouldn't make films that criticize capitalism. You should never make a film in which bankers are villains. You should never make a film that suggests that a wealthy person got their wealth in any way that's at all questionable. And if your film features characters who are failures, well, it should be clear that it's because it's their own fault. They didn't work hard enough.
So you'll notice, those of you who are online, that the questions are streaming in. You have an opportunity. Can people on the phone see the questions? You have an opportunity to vote questions up or down. Oh, I'm not able to. I guess I can't be heard. Sorry. Okay, I put this down for a second. Okay, so my question before was...
Some kind of communist? You're letting people vote on the questions?
I'm trying a new thing, so... So Slido, the questions, if you were on Slido, there's an opportunity for you to vote up or down a question that comes through. If you would like to come to a mic, please come to a mic. I'm going to bring our conversation to a close to leave time for questions. And I wanted to talk about the unwavering faith in the free market and what it's costing us as a society. You document deregulation of various sectors, the financial sector, the telecommunications sector, airlines. So what are the consequences of over-reliance on this idea?
Well, first of all, one of the things we try to make clear in the book is that there's no such thing as the free market. The free market is a myth. For one thing, people associate the so-called free market or free markets with the rise of capitalism, but markets, of course, have existed probably as long as people have existed. I mean, we have evidence of markets in ancient Assyria, in ancient Egypt, in many in ancient Rome and Greece. So people have always had markets. People have traded goods and services for as long as there have been human communities. And those markets have always had regulations. You can find rules about how markets should operate in the Old Testament. So the idea that there could ever be a market or a free market that exists apart from human society that the government intervenes or intrudes upon is itself part of the myth. As long as we have had markets, we have had rules for how markets should operate, whether you can buy alcohol in Utah or how much alcohol can be in your beer, whether you can buy alcohol on a Sunday in Massachusetts. You have to have a license to sell alcohol in every state in this country. You have to have a license to cut hair. You have to have a license to cut fingernails. Mm-hmm. So, we have all kinds of rules and regulations about markets, and the argument we make in the book is that that's fine, but these are political questions. It's a political question to what extent we regulate markets or to what extent we don't, and what we do regulate. It's a political and moral question whether children should work in mills, mines, and factories. It's a political and moral question whether it should be okay to dump carbon pollution in the atmosphere. And so the third of the book is really about the consequences of market fundamentalism. And so we show how since the 1980s, actually the late 70s, beginning with Jimmy Carter, but then accelerating under Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton, the United States deregulated many markets, including telecommunications, aviation, trucking, and the results in some cases are mixed, in other cases clearly disastrous. And yet the market fundamentalists have never really come to grips with this, right? You don't see a lot of conservative commentators saying, well, let's have a conversation about what telecommunications deregulation did and the media consolidation that we now face, the complete evisceration of local newspapers in America, big consequences for communication, for our democracy, because we've lost the diversity of communication outlets that we used to have. Why is it that we lost them? Well, one reason was because there used to be something called the fairness doctrine, that if you had a radio license or a television license, that was considered a public trust. It was considered that the government gave you a license to have a radio station, and in exchange for that, you had certain obligations. And one of those obligations was that if you had an editorial supporting, say, a particular political candidate or a certain policy, you had an obligation to give equal time to a responsible spokesperson of a different view. And some of us can remember when we were children that often there would be that on television or on the radio. The fairness doctrine was eliminated under Ronald Reagan as an unnecessary regulation, an unnecessary government encroachment on the marketplace. And it allowed, well, two things happened. It allowed massive consolidation of media. So today, it also used to be true that there was a limit to how many radio stations or how many television stations one person could own. Mm-hmm. Now, across the country, one group, the Sinclair Broadcasting Company, owns something like, I forgot the number, it's in the book, 3,000 radio stations. That would not have been possible in the past. It would also not have been possible to have something like Fox News. That would have been illegal because Fox News would have been required when Tucker Carlson gets on and say masks are idiotic or stupid, they would have been required to have a public health official say, well, actually, let me explain to you why masks make sense. So there's this tremendous consequences for communication and for democracy that we lost, that we allowed this kind of consolidation and we lost this notion of fairness. There are many, many examples in the book, and I can see time is up, but the big one that I have to say something about before the evening is over is climate change. I mean,
that is in the questions. Let me turn to some of those now.
Yeah.
Thank you for those of you who've asked questions. My apologies for not being audible earlier in the evening. I'm going to go with the questions that have the most votes, and then I'll try to consolidate as well. Democracy works. The first question is, all the institutions and groups with power are invested in the myth. How do we dismantle it? And I want to pair that with a question from Daniel. Daniel, I'd love to hear Professor Oreskes' thoughts on modern-day corporate propagandism. How has the phenomenon changed? Has it gotten worse as a result of technology, social and legal developments in the era that you were since the time you were writing about in The Big Myth?
Mm-hmm. Okay,
and then,
more?
Okay, well, but this one is the one I think that you had asked.
Okay.
Are there prominent tactics that are shared by the climate propagandists that you reveal in The Merchants of Doubt and the market fundamentalist propagandists? Are they one and the same? If so, what can we learn to question regarding the intent and spread of future subversive messages? And that question is from Brody Levin.
Okay, so there's a lot there. I'll do my best to stay focused. So we came to this story through our work on climate change. So Merchants of Doubt was really about climate change denial. And in writing that book, Eric Conway and I wanted to understand why intelligent, educated people would reject the findings of scientists. And what we found was market fundamentalist. We found that the climate deniers were almost never scientists themselves, although they sometimes pretended to be. They weren't people who had actually studied the science and said, well, you know, I have a concern about the cloud parameterization in this model. No, they were motivated by market fundamentalism because they were afraid, they basically accepted the Indivisibility Thesis, they were afraid that if the government regulated the marketplace to tax carbon or ban fossil fuels or whatever the remedy was, that this would put us on a slippery slope to totalitarianism, that we would lose our political freedoms. And when we discovered that, that's what led us then back to Well, why would people believe that, right? Where did that come from? Because climate change is a market failure. Lord Nicholas Stern, who was the former chief economist of the World Bank, has called climate change the largest and most wide-ranging market failure in human history. So here you have a complete refutation of market fundamentalism, a refutation of the notion that markets solve our problems, because markets created this problem, but we need some kind of government response to fix it, right? And if you think about the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the IPCC, proposals for carbon pricing, I mean, these are all government actions, right?
Can I jump in?
Yeah, sure.
There's a question from Haley.
Okay.
Can I be heard? No. Hello? Hello?
Did it turn off by accident?
Hello? Hi? Hello? It's green.
You want to borrow mine
Okay.
again?
Well, if you want to read out Haley's question.
Well, I don't have my reading glasses, so that won't work. Technology is not always better.
Sorry. Hello? I'm sorry. Haley suggests history seems to be repeating itself. This is in response to or referencing your climate conversation. The head of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company is the president of COP, that's the Conference on Parties of those who've signed this Framework Convention on Climate Change, COP 28 in Dubai. Is climate diplomacy more or less safe from corporate capture today than compared to the history that you've discussed in your book?
Yeah, and this, of course, relates to the question about how it's changed or not over time. So, of course, all these things change over time to some extent because the world changes and, no two historical examples are exactly the same, but the patterns are the same. And so what we've seen in recent years is that, so back in the 1930s, radio was the most important communication means in the United States. And so radio was the prime focus of many of these propaganda efforts. So you can guess where they are now. They're on social media. And actually, my team right now, we have a new project tracking disinformation on social media. And I can tell you that many of these same arguments are being recycled even as we speak, and particularly the government encroachment. So just recently, some of you have probably heard about the attempts to ban gas stoves and new construction in New York and other places. The scientific evidence for the harms of using gas in cooking in your home is overwhelming, not just for climate change, but actually even for public health, and particularly in communities of color where people may be living in houses that are poorly ventilated or where the piping is old and decrepit. Gas leaks are ubiquitous and very, very damaging to people's health, as well as the fact that methane, which is what natural gas is a potent greenhouse gas that's 80 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. So quite appropriately, both public health officials and climate people have been working to bring attention to gas and to think about how we can reduce our use of gas in many places, but particularly our homes. The gas industry has launched this massive campaign on social media, and it's the same old deja vu all over again. They don't say that they're funded by the gas industry. They say they're funded by concerned citizens for individual rights, or they have some nice-sounding name. It's all very Orwellian. The name is usually the opposite of what they're actually doing, and you have to do work to figure out who's actually paying for the ad. But there are ways you can do this, and I'm working with a computer scientist who knows how to do this, which is very great. So shout out to my colleague Una Mae O'Reilly at MIT. So we can show that the gas industry is funding these ads, and they're all about government encroachment. This is the government telling you what to do, and if you let them tell you whether you can have a gas stove, the next thing you know, they're taking away your hamburgers.
This is fascinating. I'm going to jump to another audience question, but you mentioned, and I want to look forward to this new book on disinformation and computer science.
Oh, that'll be a few years out.
Well, but you mentioned MIT, and I understand that they have a strong commitment to humanities there. I don't know if that's okay.
Yeah,
okay. But
it'll be a different
the importance of having humanities in conversation with technology is significant.
Yeah.
The next question, I could listen to you. It's a compliment. It's kind of a compliment. I could listen to you talk about history for hours. How can history and storytelling help our communities and our country come together?
Well, I think one of the key roles of history is to understand how we've got to where we are today. I mean, we face these tremendous problems of political polarization, of disinformation, and one of the ways you begin to fight things is first to diagnose it. When I first started working on climate change, which is going back 20 years, almost everyone I spoke to thought that climate change denial was a problem of public understanding of science, that it was a problem of scientific literacy. And so if we could just get scientists to explain the science more clearly, then people would understand it and they would, of course, act and everything would be fine. Well, that was a wrong diagnosis, because the problem wasn't that people didn't understand the science. The problem was that people were being bombarded by disinformation. We were being told that there was no consensus, that we didn't really know, that it would be too expensive to fix, that if we tried to fix it, it would wreck the economy. And anyway, it's no big deal, we'll just adapt. That was the message that was coming out of corporate America. And when we were able to expose it and say, this is not a real scientific debate, this is a political debate, that was very empowering for a lot of people. It was empowering for scientists who didn't know what they were up to and why their efforts were falling so flat. It was powerful for community activists, and it was powerful, I think, for anyone to understand what the problem was. Because if you have the right diagnosis, then the remedies will be different. I mean, it's like a disease. If you go to the doctor and you get the wrong diagnosis, he or she gives you a bunch of drugs and they don't work. So I see history in many ways as a kind of diagnostic activity of diagnosing what is this thing we're facing? How did we get here? Because if we know what it is, then we can begin to think about how to change it.
Okay, thank you for that. I'll combine these two questions because they're quick and I think they may be our last ones. Is the big myth strictly an American phenomenon, or has it spread to other countries? And then the second question, does your book cover the current Supreme Court, which I know it doesn't, but interestingly...
It's long enough.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating read, but Justice Sonia Sotomayor was the guest lecturer for the American Association of Law Schools meeting, and in response to a question asked of her, what does the court need? What do you want to see in amicus briefs? She said more history.
Yes. There you go.
All right.
Well, and in fact, in the West Virginia decision, the court opened up this universe of opportunity for historians, right? So anyone interested in that, you should come and talk to us later, because there's a huge amount of work now that could potentially be done, but that's another thing, yeah.
Right. So international myth.
Yeah, so one of the interesting things about this whole story is that it is mostly American. And when we wrote Merchants of Doubt, part of the reason that I became interested in that problem was because I was traveling a lot at the time, spending a lot of time in Europe, and climate change denial was not a thing in Europe in the early 2000s. It just was not a thing. And I even had colleagues and friends in England and Germany and France who would say to me, like, what's the matter with the United States? It's like, it's not just Kansas, right? And so part of the challenge was to try to understand, why was this a particularly American problem? And so this book, in a way, explains it. Because what we see is this piece of American history where American business leaders worked consciously to promote a false idea, an untrue story, in a way that Europeans did not. Now, why Europeans didn't is a different book, but it is a different story, and that's, again, one of the things that history brings to bear. Different cultures, different histories, different places, people do respond differently to questions, challenges, and understanding those different responses is really important too, because, if we want international agreements about climate change, we can't assume that people in other countries are viewing it the same way we are viewing it.
That is a wonderful answer to close on, that there are cultural particularities, but we face universal problems, and that knowing our history ourselves and where we're situated can significantly help us address some of these questions and confront the problems. Please join me in thanking Professor Oreskes tonight. And if you enjoyed this conversation, please join us for upcoming events. Climate was on the consciousness and in the room tonight. On March 2nd, we will have Brett Ray, who's the author of Generation Dread, Finding Purpose in the Age of a Changing Climate. Or the climate crisis. And then on March 16th, we'll celebrate the 35th anniversary of the center with author Kim Stanley Robinson. And his most recent novel, The Ministry for the Future, also takes up themes of our changing climate. He will deliver the Tanner Lecture on Human Values. There's more information about these events on our website and outside on our table. And the professor will be outside with her book signing, and thanks to the King's English, our hosts, our co-hosts, for providing the books. Thank you for coming tonight. Have a good evening.